Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played by Efim Bogoljubov and Alexander Alekhine, two very strong European chess masters of the 20th century. And this was played in the Hastings Six Masters tournament in Hastings, the United Kingdom. And without further ado, let's look at this game. Bogoljubov starts with d4, and now f5 by Alekhine, the Dutch defense, and now c4. Knight f6, g3, e6, bishop g2, and now bishop b4 check. And after bishop d2, it's kind of similar to the Bogo Indian, an opening where black will try to control the e4 square. And it is very similar to the Bogo Indian in the sense that black is also trying to control the e4 square in this case, and he's also developing his bishop to b4, and black's main idea will be to fianchetto his bishop, and so on and so forth. So Alekhine exchanges the bishops, and now knight c6, attacking the d4 pawn. Knight gf3, and now both sides castle, and now d6 by Alekhine. The queen goes to b3, and this is kind of pressuring the a2 g8 diagonal, and here Alekhine just moves his king. He doesn't want his king to be on the line of this queen. Although there wasn't really much danger of this queen being on b3, as the bishop at the moment is defending the e6 pawn, and although this knight can come to g5 and put more pressure on this e6 pawn, black is just fine by playing moves like queen e7, developing his queen, and then he's going to kick the knight away with something like h6. So really, king h8 wasn't really that necessary, but Alekhine still decides to do it. And here, Bogoljubov plays a rather strange move. He plays queen c3. And this is strange because he already moved his queen to b3, and he's moving it again. You could argue that he has already developed all of his pieces, so it doesn't matter that he's moving his queen twice, but you should probably centralize your rooks before moving that queen again. And here, Alekhine plays e5. And this seems to be a pawn sacrifice because if you count the amount of defenders versus the attackers, Bogoljubov wins. But if you consider the tactical variations that Alekhine has, then Bogoljubov is actually lost. If he captures the pawn, and after d takes e5, let's say that he is a bit greedy with knight takes e5, then Alekhine can calmly just capture the knight, and after the queen captures this knight, queen captures d2. The main reason was to overload the queen, which was defending the d2 knight and also the e5 square. So it's not really possible to capture the pawn and win a pawn. Bogoljubov just plays e3 and reinforces his d4 pawn, and now a5 by Alekhine, preparing a move like knight to b4, and also just gaining space on the queen side. And here, b3. And b3 is perhaps an incorrect move. If you consider the plan that Bogoljubov had, you'll probably understand why b3 is an incorrect move. So b3, queen e8, and now a3. So if we can see here, Bogoljubov is trying to prepare the move b4. And after the files open up, he will have more control over the a file than Alekhine does. But b3 was unnecessary here. You could have just played a3 in the beginning, and one could argue that, yes, there is a4, which does grab more space, but then you don't have to fight for the a file. You can try opening up the d file with something like d takes e5, and after d takes e5, you're of course not going to capture again, but you could play a move like rook a to d1, and you have a good amount of control. Instead, after a5 was played, b3, and now queen e8, and now a3. So preparing b4, and here the queen just comes to h5. Alekhine is getting ready to prepare an attack, and now the pawn on e5 could be won, since after d takes e5, there's no more threat along the d file. So can you win a pawn? Well, I'm going to give you this as a puzzle and ask you what would happen if this was played. Knight takes e5. What would you play here? Okay, so like in the other position, knight takes e5 would be played. And here, let's say you capture the knight. Well, this would allow this nice knight to g4 move. And after knight g4, there's not only a threat of queen takes h2 checkmate, but there's also a threat on the queen. So, of course, there's nowhere for you to go that defends both threats. The best move is knight f3, but after the simple knight takes e5, black is completely winning. I mean, he's up a queen. So, therefore, the pawn is defended with a tactic. So, h4 was played instead, just getting rid of the threat, and now there actually is a threat of d takes e5 and winning a pawn. But Alekhine just plays knight g4, and he's defending the e5 pawn again. Knight g5 by Bogoljubov. This is rather a strange move because the knight will be kicked away, and it'll have to go back to either f3 or a worse square, like h3. So there's no real point of bringing the knight to g5 anyway. But Bogoljubov does it, and after bishop d7, he plays f3. So this ensures that he has to bring his knight back to h3, should it be kicked away. Knight f6, f4, and now e4. So the knight is definitely going to h3. And that is what happened. And here d5 by Alekhine. And what Alekhine is trying to do is, of course, open up the position more. And unfortunately, you cannot break the tension by playing c takes d5, because after this, knight takes d5, and there's no way for you to protect this e3 pawn. And after that e3 pawn falls, the pawn chain is very weak. So instead, not exchanging, but rather playing knight to f1. And after knight e7 was played, just trying to reroute the knight, here Bogoljubov plays a4. And this is kind of counterintuitive to what he was trying to prepare, because you were noticing that he was playing b3 and a3, which might signal that he was getting ready to play b4. But for some reason, he's given up on that idea completely, and now he's trying to push his pawn to a4. Which does control a good amount of squares, but it weakens this b4 square severely. And as we can see, Alekhine will take advantage of this by putting his knight on that square. So he does. He plays knight c6, and after rook d2, knight b4. There was really no way of preventing that knight to go to b4, so Bogoljubov couldn't have done anything to prevent it. Although now he can try to exchange one of his knights for Alekhine's knights. Knight b4, and now bishop h1. And if you just look at this position from a glance, you could tell that Bogoljubov isn't really having a good position. You can see that his bishop and knight on h3, they're very passive. And, okay, you may say that Alekhine's bishop is also not as active, but it has more potential than Bogoljubov's bishop. You can see that every single square that Bogoljubov's bishop can go to is quite bad, or it's not really doing anything there. So queen e8, just trying to transfer the queen onto a better square, and now rook to g2. Unfortunately, rook to g2 is not really preparing to push this pawn to g4, because there's way too many defenders on that square. But here, Alekhine just takes on c4, and after b takes c4, he wins a pawn. If you capture this pawn with your queen instead, then after bishop e6, now Alekhine has actually gotten a good diagonal for his bishop. For example, let's say you capture this pawn on c7. Well, then you don't have to capture the pawn immediately. You can play rook f7. And if Bogoljubov tries to be greedy and defend the pawn, then after queen c3, you can see that after rook c8, despite being down a pawn, Alekhine's initiative is way too good. You can see that he's attacking the queen. All of his pieces are active, and now if he can just play something like rook f to c7, or perhaps something like knight f to d5, then his position will be so good. So, after d takes c4, b takes c4 was played, and now bishop takes a4, so winning a pawn. But then again, if you do take with the queen, you would give black lots of activity. Knight f2 was played, and now bishop to d7, just retreating the bishop, and now knight to d2. So this pawn sacrifice was just to get this knight into a good square, namely the b3 square. And now b5 was played, and Alekhine is sacrificing the pawn back. And indeed, you could capture a pawn with c takes b5, and after bishop takes b5, the c7 pawn falls, and the a5 pawn is also very weak. But again, Alekhine is the one who is favored in this position because of his activity. So instead of taking on b5 and winning a pawn, knight d1 was played. And after this, knight d3. And Alekhine just has a very good advantage that Bogoljubov can't really diminish it at all. Rook takes a5 was played, and now, rather than taking the rook, which would be an okay move, Alekhine plays b4. And here's where the real fun starts happening. Rook takes a8 is played, and now b takes c3. You could capture the rook, and that is indeed alright, but b takes c3 is better. And after rook takes e8, we have not even capturing the rook, but c2. And now how can you prevent this pawn from queening? Rook takes f8 check was played, and now king h7, and how do you stop it? Indeed, you could have captured the rook after rook takes e8. You could just simply play something like rook takes e8. But after knight takes c3, this would allow Bogoljubov to liquidate. The queens are off the board. He has an open b file that he can use, and also an open a file he can use, and this would actually be better for Bogoljubov. His pieces can finally start being active. He can bring his bishop to g2 and then f1. He can give it up for that d3 knight, and then he surely will have an advantage. So therefore, after rook takes e8, Alekhine played c2, and now rook takes f8, and after king h7, unfortunately, there's no way to stop the pawn. And in fact, this game is famous because Alekhine will sacrifice his queen 3 times. So he already sacrificed it on e8, and now after knight f2, he plays c1 queen check, so he's got a new queen. And okay, if you count the material, white has 6 pawns, black has 5 pawns, and black has 2 knights and a bishop, and so does white. And white also has 2 rooks for the queen. So white is actually up material, in fact. He is up 2 points. 1 extra point from the 2 rooks against the queen, and 1 extra point because he has an extra pawn. But you can see that these rooks are very hard to coordinate for Bogoljubov. And although he does have more material, his pieces are not as active as Alekhine's are. So knight f1 was played, and now knight e1. Rather than exchanging the knight for the f2 knight, which isn't really doing much, you could rather put the knight on a square like f3, and then you'd be way better. Knight e1 was played, and the rook only has 1 move, which is h2, and now queen takes c4. So winning a pawn, and now Bogoljubov is only up 1 point in material, but it doesn't even matter about the points. Alekhine is just way better. His queen is way more easier to coordinate than both of white's flimsy rooks, and if black can get this bishop to b5 move in, he is definitely going to be enjoying his advantage. Rook b8 was played, and now bishop b5 still, and here, unfortunately, Bogoljubov had to give up his rook for the bishop. If you tried playing knight to d2 and moving the knight away, which is really the only square, if you played bishop to g2, then after knight takes g2, then you would still lose the knight. No matter which way you capture, the knight is going to be hanging. So if you played knight to d2, then after the simple queen c1, yeah, this isn't going to turn out good. There's a threat of knight f3 check. So instead, rook takes b5 was played, and after queen takes b5, now Bogoljubov is way worse. All of his pieces are stuck on one side, and Alekhine's queen is way better than Bogoljubov's rook and bishop. g4 was played, and now knight f3 check, just trading off some more pieces. Bishop takes f3, e takes f3, and now g takes f5. Okay? And now queen e2 by Alekhine. He is trying to infiltrate into the position, and here we have d5. It's really hard to find a move here for Bogoljubov. Unfortunately, he cannot have any good discoveries with this f2 knight. If he plays the move knight h3, then after the simple knight g4, black is winning. You have to capture the queen, otherwise it's mate if you move the rook. So after rook takes e2, f takes e2, you can't stop the pawn from queening. For example, let's say knight f2. You could even play knight takes e3 here. And it just shows how uncoordinated these knights are. If the knight goes to d3 to prevent the pawn from queening on e1, then you will take this knight on f1 with check. So there's no way to really stop this. And if you play knight f2, then that doesn't help either, because you're simply going to lose this rook on h2. And you can see where I'm going with this. So after queen e2 was played, d5. And d5 is probably the only good move there really is. But Alekhine doesn't take it. He instead plays the waiting game with Bogoljubov. He plays king g8, seeing how many moves that Bogoljubov can play. And after h5, he still doesn't capture the pawn. He plays king h7. And now, this is really hard to play. e4, and now knight takes e4. Knight takes e4, queen takes e4. And this is just worse for Bogoljubov in a lot of ways. You can see that his pawn structure gives one of the reasons why he's losing. If you compare it to Alekhine's pawn structure, it's way better. So here, Bogoljubov played d6. There's really hardly anything else to play. C takes d6 was played, and now f6. He's starting to give up pawns. G takes f6, and now you could play f5 and continue giving up pawns, but instead, rook d2 was played. And here, rook d2 was a huge mistake, although it's really hard to suggest another move for Bogoljubov here. You can see that that f4 pawn is going to be lost. Black is going to have like the d6 pawn as a passed pawn. It's hard to say anything that Bogoljubov can do. But after rook d2, Alekhine simply wins instantly. And this is the second queen sacrifice that Alekhine plays. So I encourage you to pause the video, and if you want, you can try solving this. Okay, so here Alekhine played the move queen e2. And this isn't rather much of a queen sacrifice, but you're kind of forcing matters into your hand. Here, you could push f5 and make a waiting move, but this won't really help you that much. Instead, Bogoljubov just decided to end things quickly. He played rook takes e2, and after f takes e2, it's not another queen for Alekhine because white does have king f2, and he stops the queen. But after e takes f1 check, this is the third queen sacrifice. King takes f1. This is just a winning pawn endgame for Alekhine. He plays king g7, and after king f2, king f7, king e3. Both sides bring their king into the game, but Bogoljubov is simply lost. After king e4, d5 check was played by Alekhine, and here Bogoljubov resigned the game. It's hopeless for him. It's a simply lost king and pawn endgame. Let's say king d4 would be played, then king f5. And this is lost. You can capture this pawn, but then you lose this pawn. And this pawn is going to be the fourth queen. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.